Well, comrades, let me start off with a quote from Orwell. This is something he wrote in homage to Catalonia, and I think it puts his ideas in a nutshell. One had breathed the air of equality. I am well aware that it is now the fashion to deny that socialism has anything to do with equality. In every country in the world, a huge tribe of party hacks and sleek little professors are busy proving that socialism means no more than a planned state capitalism with the grad motive left intact. But fortunately, there also exists a vision of socialism quite different from this. The thing that attracts ordinary men to socialism, makes them willing to risk their skins for it, the mystique of socialism, is the idea of equality. To the vast majority of people, socialism means a classless society, or it means nothing at all. Now, I would argue that this is one of the lessons that Orwell drew from Spain, and that really this remained at the core of his politics right up until his death. We don't know how his politics would have developed if he'd lived longer, of course, but they remained at the core of his politics right up to his death. But at the same time, what we have to be aware of is that he was negotiating, if you like, his way through a world of tremendous change. The Second World War, all the movements that are associated with that. Orwell was negotiating his way through very difficult times, and that central core of his beliefs, if you like, comes under all sorts of pressure. And what I want to do is look at the pressures it comes under and the extent to which he actually kept true to that central core as well. I don't think Orwell was a saint. I think Orwell did lots of things that were wrong. I think Orwell became involved with people he shouldn't be involved with. I think Orwell, throughout his life, really, I think he was beginning to change before he died, but Orwell was a man with very sexist attitudes, the attitudes of most men of his time. There are a whole number of criticisms you can make of George Orwell, but nevertheless, I would argue that when he went to Spain, he became committed to the idea of a socialist revolution, a radical transformation in society, the creation of a classless society, and that this is something that right up until his death he still thought was what people should aspire to. This was something that he actually remained committed to. Now, as I'm sure people know, Orwell was an old Etonian. He left Eton and he joined the Indian police force and went to Burma to be a policeman. He came back, and when I say a policeman, in fact a police officer with a load of native policemen under him. He wasn't a constable, he was someone in charge of constables. He came back from Burma and he was moving to the left, I would argue. He was very much someone who wanted to identify with the oppressed, but I would argue very strongly that it's Spain that is the sort of the decisive moment, and in fact Orwell argues this himself. He says later on that everything he's written since Spain has been in defence of democratic socialism and against totalitarianism. This is something he argues after the Second World War. Spain was the decisive moment. Now, when he goes to Spain, initially he's very sympathetic to the Communist Party approach. The Communist Party were arguing that the revolution should be put on hold and everything should be geared up to winning the war, and anything that interfered with the winning the war in their way of thinking, in fact, an end should be put to it. You shouldn't alienate France, Britain and America. Everything had to be done to avoid alienating these countries. Every effort should be made to conciliate the middle class and the upper middle class in Spain. All this was necessary to win the war. And Orwell was quite sympathetic to this idea. He didn't actually join the international brigades at this time because they wouldn't let him. Harry Pollitt didn't like the road to Wigan Pier, and they put a block on Orwell joining the international brigades. Orwell himself later on said that he thought that if he had joined the international brigades, and he'd have probably met with a fatal accident instead of making it back home. But nevertheless, when he went to Spain, he was very sympathetic to the communist idea, the communist approach, but he joins the Poon militia. And it's while he's serving with the Poon militia that he begins to see things a bit differently. He argues the communist line, according to his own account, in the trenches with the Poon. He argues the communist line. It comes to May 1937, and Orwell is actually making arrangements to transfer to the international brigades. The Catalan front is a quiet front in the war. There isn't a lot of fighting going on. The decisive battles are being fought on the Madrid front, and Orwell wants to transfer to the International Brigades to take part in these battles. And by now, the International Brigades are very keen to recruit him because they can use him coming over to them as a way of bashing the argument that the POUM were advancing, that the revolution had to be completed. What changes Orwell's mind about all this, of course, is the May events in Barcelona in 1937. Far from the Communist Party being actually committed to the idea of putting the revolution on hold, it becomes absolutely clear that the Communist Party is actually committed to the liquidation of the revolution. Orwell himself wrote much about this time that people didn't realise that in fact the Communist Party has become, as far as socialism is concerned, has become a counter-revolutionary force in Spain. They're not out to bring about socialism, they're there purely to serve the interests of the Soviet Union. And what Orwell sees is the workers' power that he had embraced in Barcelona that made socialism real for him, and this is something he argued himself. I have seen socialism in practice, this is something worth fighting for. Orwell's commitment to this is absolute. You know, this was a turning point in his life, and in May 1937 what he finds is that in fact it's the Communist Party that is trying to close all this down. You know, and Orwell takes part in the uprising against the communist provocations that are being mounted in Catalonia, and subsequently, of course, as I'm sure people know, he goes on the run. You know, when they actually move to suppress the POUM, Orwell is one of those people who go on the run. By now, he's been wounded. He's been shot in the throat. He's seriously ill. There's no doubt in my mind that if he'd been arrested, he would have died in custody. Perhaps not murdered, although they did have him down in the secret police files. They did have him down as a Trotskyist. He might well have been murdered, but even if he hadn't been murdered, I'm pretty sure he would have died from mistreatment, from bad treatment, or from neglect. One of his mates was a bloke called George's Kopp. And Kopp was very badly treated when he was in communist custody. He lost something like 7 stone in weight, something like that. It's not a bad thing for some people, I think of myself, but that would have killed Orwell. That mistreatment would certainly have killed Orwell, who was recovering, from a serious wound. Orwell draws 2 conclusions from Spain. One is that workers' power is something worth fighting for. A very clear idea of what workers' power is. It's a classless society where the ruling class are either dead, completely dispossessed, or on the run. There's no ambiguity about this. It's not that we've introduced certain reforms, like the ruling class have had to put up with the National Health Service, or the ruling class have had to accept large compensation for certain industries being nationalised, industries that were bankrupt anyway. As far as Orwell was concerned, socialism was the ruling class on the run. I mean, one of my favourite CLR James quotes is a quote that you only know you're winning when the ruling class are running for their lives. There's a lot to be said for that, comrades. This was Orwell's attitude then, that you need a classless society, and that means that the ruling class are gone. And this was the touchstone, I would argue, of his politics right up until his death. He makes all sorts of compromises because of, as he would have argued, I'm sure, events and circumstances, but nevertheless, I would still argue that this was at the core of his understanding of socialism. Not only that, but as far as he was concerned, socialism had to be international. He accepted not just the Trotskyist argument, the various arguments you had from a whole range of people on the left at this time, that socialism couldn't be in one country, it had to be an international phenomenon. And I would argue once again, this is something that he adhered to absolutely up to the time he died. That socialism was a classless society, and socialism was something that had to be international. Now when he comes back to Britain, Orwell adopts quite a hard line position, clearly influenced by Trotskyism. I think Homage to Catalonia can be legitimately described as a Trotskyist book. He wasn't a follower of Trotsky, but I think he was very influenced by Trotskyist ideas. he adopts quite a hard line as far as the politics of the time are concerned. He's very much anti-war, which he sees an imperialist war that is going to come and that will result in some sort of fascist regime in Britain of some kind or other. But what you get is a dramatic change. There's absolutely no question about it. A dramatic change in 1939, 1940, when war breaks out. Orwell, as I'm sure people know, declares himself a patriot. You know, and I think part of the influence of this was the Hitler-Stalin Pact. I think he'd have found it much harder to embrace this idea of revolutionary patriotism that he put forward if it had been something the communists had been championing at the same time. But what you get is Orwell argues, by 1940, and you've got to remember, 1940, the French are defeated, there's a Nazi-occupied Europe, the Nazis are actually allied with the Soviet Union, the Russians have invaded Finland, they've occupied a big chunk of Eastern Europe themselves, they took half of Poland, they grabbed a bit of Romania, they've occupied the Baltic states. This was a very dark time, if you like, and what Orwell argued is that the only way that Britain could win this war was if there was a socialist revolution in Britain. You actually had you had to have a socialist transformation in Britain. This was absolutely vital, and this had to be the precipitator, if you like, of a socialist revolution throughout occupied Europe as well. This was Orwell's argument. He edited a number of books at the time, the Searchlight series of books, and in this series of books, you get one written about Germany, and the argument is that the British government, the British Labour movement, should be supporting a revolution in Germany. That we should actually that there should be set up in Britain a revolutionary government to which Germans could rally. He sees another book was a book about Spain, that Spain had to be liberated as one of the war aims. That Franco was not someone that the Allies should do deals with, as they did later on. Franco was an enemy. Franco had to be brought down. In terms of Britain, Orwell himself wrote The Lion and the Unicorn, and this is a very interesting book. The use of the word revolutionary patriotism, this idea that he celebrates Englishness. I find some of this, I must admit, I do find off-putting, the celebration of Englishness. But if you put it into the context of the time, what you have is Orwell arguing for a programme that really, though he by now he's moved away from the more hardline Trotskyist stance he's adopted, he's still calling for what he described as a genuine socialist movement, not the Labour Party. Forget the Labour Party at this time. On one occasion he said the Labour Party is full of politicians whose only real concern is to swap places regularly with the Tories. They're not actually committed to any change. In fact, in terms of policy, they're very similar to the Tories. It's a very contemporary ring to it, hasn't it? This is the way he regarded the Labour Party in 1940, 1941. But what you get is he calls for a very radical programme that, for instance, involves, as he calls it, the democratisation of the British education system. Now, there's a recent book come out that I actually review in the latest ISJ, where the bloke says that this was done by the 1944 Education Act. So Orwell, what he demanded was satisfied. What Orwell called for was for the nationalisation of the great public schools. As far as I'm aware, that hasn't happened yet. And he called for the closing down of most private schools, and the idea was that you needed a democratic system of education that eliminated the privileges of the ruling class. This was what it comes down to. A classless society needed a democratic education system. He called for the nationalisation of industry, of finance, but this was nationalisation without compensation. This was not what you had the Labour government do in 1945-51. This was the expropriation of the rich, not helping them out by taking bankrupt industries off their hands and giving them generous compensation. And he also called for the nationalisation of all land. All urban land would be nationalised, taken under state control, and no one would be able to own more than 15 acres of rural land. This is quite radical stuff, and what Orwell argued is that there was developing in Britain a mass socialist movement that wanted to win the war, and that was increasingly recognising that the war could only be won if Britain became socialist. Now, one issue he dealt with was if such a movement did come about, Orwell saw it taking power, if you like, through Parliament. It would be a mass movement, but nevertheless he saw it coming to power by a mixture of mass movements on the streets and Parliament. But he did consider the question of what would the rich be doing while all this was going on. And I think a lot of today's reformists actually dodge this question. If the sort of programme that they advocate was actually put in place, what would the rich actually do? And what Orwell said was, of course, that if this programme is put forward, then the streets will have to run with blood. He was not a bloodthirsty man. What he meant was they will resist, they will try to organise an uprising against a democratic attempt to introduce socialism, and they will have to be put down by force. Now, I don't know, keep picking on the book that I review, but the book that I review, the bloke says there that he said this, but he didn't mean it. It doesn't fit in. Orwell didn't actually mean the streets would have to run with blood. It's a bit of hyperbole. Well, he did mean it, because he wrote...
The miners' strike. Like the reaction to the miners' strike.
Absolutely. Anything like that, you have to consider what will the ruling class do. They ain't going to stand by. They will take countermeasures. And what Orwell said very explicitly, he wrote an article for the Left Book Club's magazine, Left News, I think it was, and he actually says, if there is a movement like this, then the ruling class will rise up against it. That they will never let socialism be voted through by parliamentary vote without actually taking up arms to defend their property. He was absolutely explicit about this. They will never let this happen peacefully. And I think this is something that, a lot of, some of our ex-comrades who are moving in a reformist direction don't actually confront. They're not picking, I don't want to pick on Owen Jones, but let's pick on Owen Jones for a minute. You look at someone like Owen Jones, if the Labour Party embraced his programme, or what he says is his programme, what would the ruling class response be? What would the ruling class response be if you actually had a Labour Party that tried to introduce socialism? It's not going to happen, but if they did, what you would have is British parliamentary democracy would suddenly be something that they could well do without. This is the reality of history. This is what history teaches, and this is something that Orwell realised, that any serious attempt to introduce socialism will meet with armed resistance from the ruling class. It's absolutely clear in Orwell's writings at this time. What he argued was that we will be able to beat them because the Home Guard is the people in arms. Do you forget Dad's Army? This is rather spoiled our memory of the Home Guard. Not that I have a memory, I'm not that old, but this has rather spoiled the idea of the Home Guard. But as far as Orwell was concerned, the Home Guard was the people in arms, and if they try to rise up against a socialist government in Britain, then the Home Guard can put them down. And Orwell in 1940, 41, 42 thought that some sort of socialist revolution was inevitable. This was the only way the war could be won. And on one occasion he actually wrote that we have to take up the Trotskyist slogan, that's the word he used, that there'll be no victory without socialism and no socialism without victory. This was Orwell's argument at this point in time. He was not alone in arguing this. There was a substantial number of people arguing this. Now, much later, Orwell wrote an article for Partisan Review, the semi-Trotskyist American magazine, where he said, I got it all wrong. What I didn't reckon on was the Germans attacking Stalin and Russia coming into the war. What I didn't count on was the Americans coming into the war, and in effect the Russians and the Americans saved the British ruling class. The war could be won without a socialist revolution in Britain. He actually makes that point absolutely explicitly. And what you had, as far as he was concerned, was as a turning point, the moment that illustrated this, what you had was a situation where in 1942 you have Gandhi launched the Quit India movement. The British have got to pull out of India, and the failure of any sort of mass movement in Britain to support the Congress Party, to support Indian resistance, as far as Orwell was concerned, this showed that the revolutionary opportunity, if you like, had passed. he didn't know that the man who actually ordered Gandhi's arrest was not Winston Churchill. He was off at an international conference. It was the deputy leader, the deputy prime minister, a certain Clement Attlee, had actually ordered Gandhi's arrest. But you had, Gandhi arrested, the Congress movement banned, you had large numbers of troops putting down Indian resistance, and as far as Orwell was concerned, this was the moment when it became clear that there wasn't going to be an English revolution. That it had been an illusion, if you like, that the Americans and the Russians were going to save the British ruling class, and they were going to come out of the war with their position intact. Their position intact. At this point, I think what you get is another change in Orwell's tactics, if you like. Orwell takes the decision to throw in his lot with the left of the Labour Party. He starts working for Tribune, the Tribune newspaper, and you got to remember that the Labour Party then was a very different kettle of fish from the Labour Party today. Labour people from that period would consider today's Labour Party to be a Conservative party, quite a right-wing Conservative party, I would argue. They wouldn't recognise it as having anything in common with the party that they were members of. Pardon me, the party has changed so much. I mean, you think of someone like David Blunkett. If someone with David Blunkett's politics, you go back to that period, they'd have had to defect to the Tory party. He's a piece of shit. He'd have defected to the Tory party without a doubt. He doesn't have to today because the old bloody Labour Party has moved in that direction. Ramsay MacDonald had to leave the Labour Party. Tony Blair took the Labour Party on that journey with him, I would argue. But what you've got is a situation where I think Orwell thought, a lot of criticisms of the Labour Party, too moderate, compromised, all sorts of criticisms of it, but he thought, I'll join the Labour Party, I can be one of the people helping to change the Labour Party. Of course, what you generally find is that you join the Labour Party to change it, and you find the Labour Party is much more effective at changing you. I don't think that happened to Orwell completely, but I think you do get a situation where Orwell's politics involve him in taking all sorts of decisions that derive from the fact that he'd thrown in his lot with the Labour Party. Now, one thing running through all this, of course, right the way through this period, is his anti-Stalinism. And I would argue this anti-Stalinism comes from a revolutionary stance. Orwell's very influenced by various Trotskyist writings about the Soviet Union. The reference to state capitalism in that quote shows one particular influence. He finds much more convincing, though, the American Trotskyist heresy, I suppose, associated with people like Max Shachtman, Dwight MacDonald, and the then Trotskyist James Burnham, which is the idea that the Soviet Union is a new type of class society, a bureaucratic collectivist society. It's not capitalist, it's not socialist, it's a new type of society. And I think Orwell's very influenced by this idea. And in fact, if you think of 1984, the Bronstein Manifesto is all about oligarchic collectivism, which is really bureaucratic collectivism under another name. And on a number of occasions, Orwell actually refers to Russia as a bureaucratic collectivist society. He embraces an aspect, if you like, or a Trotskyist heresy for his understanding of the Soviet Union. He knew a lot about the Soviet Union. He'd read widely about it. He knew every twist and turn that the British Communist Party had made and could hold his own without too much trouble with any number of Stalinists. One of the jokes he used to tell was in 1941, there's a group of Communist Party members meeting in a restaurant in New York, and when did they invade Russia, the Germans? December the 7th, was it? No, that was June the 21st. Right? June the 21st. It's June the 21st. And they're all sitting there saying, we've got to keep America out of the war. We've got to keep America out of the war. Because this is the Russian line. And one of them gets up and goes to the toilet. And while he's in the toilet, it's announced on the radio that the Germans have invaded Russia. And this bloke comes back and sits down and says, yeah, we've got to keep America out of the war. And I said, no. We've got to get America into the war now. We've got to get in, These twists and turns, Orwell knew them all. Pardon me. Animal Farm, I would argue, it still approaches the Soviet Union from a revolutionary point of view. If you think of the book, it's a tale of Revolution Betrayed. It's not an anti-revolutionary book, I would argue. Orwell made that explicit on a number of occasions. It wasn't intended to be anti-revolutionary. It's certainly not a book that embraces Trotskyism, because he considered the revolution went wrong at the time of Kronstadt. But if you think to the end, where the animals are looking through the window and they can't tell the pigs from the men, the critique of the Soviet Union, the pigs, is that they've become as bad as the men. They become as bad as the men. Their policies are no different from those of the imperialists, if you put the book into context of the time. What I think happens is that partly through his relationship with the Labour Party, when Labour comes to power, partly through the developing international situation, you get a change in Orwell's attitude towards the Soviet Union. And by the time you get 1984, the pigs are definitely worse than the men. He's still very critical of Western capitalism, but I think Orwell has come to see a war as threatening, and in this war he regards British Labourism and American capitalism as the lesser evil. You know, if there's going to be a war, on a number of occasions Orwell made clear he would support the United States against the Soviet Union. This is a mistake. This is not our politics. You know, neither Washington nor Moscow, confronted with this situation, Orwell actually said, well, I'm inclined to support Washington if there's a war with the Russians. This was a mistake, and I think it leads him into all sorts of difficult territory. What you also get is Orwell very critical of the Labour government when it comes to power. He is amazed at how moderate they are. They haven't got rid of the House of Lords. They haven't got rid of the public schools. They haven't sacked all the generals. MI5 is still operating. How can you explain that? MI5 is still operating. Why don't they shut it down? He's very critical of a whole number of measures. He thinks the nationalisations they're introducing are moving in a socialist direction, but he still can't understand why there's such generous compensation. He actually argues on one time that he's looking forward to the nationalisation of the national press. Which is not something a lot of his admirers get their heads round, but Orwell thought the press barons should have their newspapers taken off them. You know, it was absolutely explicit. There were dangers in this. You didn't want an undemocratic state controlling the press, but certainly he didn't see a press controlled by press barons as anything progressive. But he's very, you know, he thinks they're being much too moderate. They've got a big majority. Why are they being so conservative? You know, this is his attitude. But two things lead him to mute his criticism. One is the international situation, you know, that he is worried about the Russian threat. He is worried about British communists being a sort of fifth column for this Russian threat. He doesn't embrace McCarthyism, although sometimes I think he does come close to it. What you get as well, though, is the idea that he argues that the economy is in such a bad way that for the time being we've got to put on hold movement in a socialist direction just to make sure that the government survives. And I think this is a big mistake on his part, you know, that his attachment to Labourism pulls him to the right. It leads to a number of dangerous involvements on his part. He gives support, as I'm sure people know, to a black propaganda organisation set up by the Labour government, the Information Research Department. He has a collaboration with them. It doesn't go very far, but I think it's still unsavoury, it's still a mistake. He also is having conversations with an organisation called the International Rescue Committee. And this is an American pseudo-charity that in fact had very close relations with the State Department and with various American intelligence agencies. Later on it really becomes a front for the CIA. Some of you might know the man in charge of it at the present time is David Miliband. You know, this is the charity that David Miliband heads. British journalists know that this is a CIA front, no question about it. They know it's a CIA front. No one in any newspaper has actually challenged Miliband over the actual history of this organisation that he heads up. Orwell does not get involved in this, but he might have, he dies. I think this was a mistake on his part. But having said that, you know, what you get, pardon me, what you get is he's still in some sort of conversation, if you like, with the radical ideas that were at the core of his, that were still, I would argue, at the core of his politics. He's compromised them in the circumstances that existed at the time, but those radical ideas are still there at the core. He doesn't embrace McCarthyism. He flirts with it, but nevertheless he makes absolutely clear that he's against any sort of crackdown on the communists. One of his criticisms of the communists is they object to crackdown on them, but they actively support a crackdown on the Trotskyists and the anarchists. Him and some of his mates set up a separate organisation from the National Council of Civil Liberties because it won't support the anarchists and the Trotskyists who have been persecuted by the Labour government. He takes a whole number of good stands. He still campaigns in support of Spanish prisoners, of Franco. He takes a whole number of good stands, but in a number of ways I think his support for the Labour government pulls him to the right. But what you get is, he still argues a socialist case. He doesn't argue it, I would argue, in Tribune. He argues it in Partisan Review, the American Trotskyist paper. There's not an equivalent of this in Britain, There's not an equivalent. There are Trotskyist organisations in Britain, but Orwell doesn't take them seriously, where he does take the Americans more seriously. And they edited a series. They produced a series of articles called The Future of Socialism. One of the contributors was Victor Serge. There are a whole number of other contributors, and one they asked, because Orwell was one of their most popular columnists, was George Orwell, an article on the future of socialism. And he produces an article called Towards European Unity. And what's interesting is, the recent book, George Orwell, English Rebel, argues that Orwell embraced the English road to socialism, and he considered the Labour government of 45-51 as his beliefs in action. If that was the case, then in Orwell's article on the future of socialism, you'd have thought he'd have said, this is the way forward, the English Labour road to socialism, this is the way forward. What Orwell actually says is, if you're a socialist, then things are pretty grim. There's no sign of socialism anywhere, not in Britain, not in the Stalinist countries. The socialist movement is extremely weak. He says that he thinks that the only thing worth fighting for, even in this grim situation, is to try and establish socialism somewhere. And the place it could be established, first of all, is in the United Socialist States of Europe. And he makes absolutely clear the only thing worth fighting for is for a United Socialist States of Europe. And once again, what he means by socialism is not the nationalisation of bankrupt industries and NHS and whatever, and of course that leaves out Labour's massive rearmament programme, let alone the welfare measures they introduced. This is the only way forward, and it will have to be something that, if it's going to be socialism in a real sense of the word, is eventually got to become an international, a world phenomenon. In the end, socialism has to be global. Orwell argues this absolutely explicitly. He doesn't see much hope for it, but nevertheless, this is the only thing really that people should consider fighting for. There are all sorts of other things going on, and he's made all sorts of compromises, but when he's actually asked to write a considered piece on what he thinks is the future of socialism, what Orwell says is we need to fight for United Socialist States of Europe, and what this will involve is the eventual establishment of socialism on a global scale, and this is something that will be opposed by both the Americans and the Russians. He actually says one of the problems with Britain is we are so tied to the United States that we are likely to be part of the problem rather than part of the solution. This is Orwell thinking back to basics, I would argue. In other places he's making all sorts of compromises, but right up until his death, I would argue this is still there as the core of his beliefs. Let me end with one quotation. This is something he wrote in, I think it's 1943. And he's looking back on the Spanish War. No, I think this is, it's one of those quotations from Orwell that still has a potency today. He's talking about a militiaman, an Italian militiaman he met in Spain. He only saw him for a moment or two, but he remains with me as a sort of visual reminder of what the war was really about. He symbolises for me the flower of the European working class, harried by the police of all countries. The people who fill the mass graves of the Spanish battlefields and are now to the tune of several millions rotting in forced labour camps. The question is very simple. I think it's still very simple. The question is very simple. Should people like that Italian soldier be allowed to live the decent, fully human life which is now technically achievable, or shan't they? Shall the common man be pushed back into the mud, or shall he not? I myself believe, perhaps on insufficient grounds, that the common man shall win his fight sooner or later, but I want it to be sooner and not later. sometime within the next 100 years, say. That was the real issue of the Spanish War, and of the present war, and perhaps of other wars yet to come. Thank you.
There's a degree to which, when you're looking at art and literature, it's not just about what's in there, it's about what people take from it. And there's a sense in which Animal Farm and 1984 made me a Trotskyist. I did 1984 for O-level, and when I was about 13, I think, very precocious 13-year-old, they gave us Animal Farm to read as preparation. The time is the early 80s. There's an identification with the vague identification with the Labour left of some sort of socialism, at the same time as misgivings about the Soviet Union. So that, and just the simple fact of reading in a book this figure Snowball, who seems to be one of the good guys, and this is it Goldberg in '84, who seems to be not compromised and is offering some sort of alternative, actually got me down to the library reading everything I could find from Trotsky and Lenin, not understanding a word, going away and coming back to politics about 5 years later because it was all too complicated. But the general idea that Orwell is putting forward here is there is an alternative to the ideas of either supporting the West or supporting the Stalinism, and it's socialism, and it's basically good, is something from which eventually I think I profited. And a couple of questions on those two, and we're going on memories of what I read 30 years ago. So you understand. The first is, from what I remember, there's a fairly patronising attitude towards working class. There's Boxer in Animal Farm, and then there's the future lies with the proles, but you don't really get any sort of idea of agency of working class. They're people who we need to push them into doing something. They've got the power, but they haven't got the intelligence. The other thing in terms of which you're saying in 1984 was pro-Western. That wasn't the way I responded to it. I responded more to the idea there's these three great states always in conflict with one another, sometimes with one, sometimes other. And the way in which it came over to me really was a more sort of we're against all of these states and not that we're from one or the other. That's maybe a misreading on my part then. It may be a false memory from me then, but just in terms of you saying that 1984 as a novel was pro-Western, what's the basis for that?
It's a question. I didn't really understand what you said about this charity that David Miliband set up. How old is David Miliband, and when was this charity set up? I was a bit surprised about that. And I just wanted to mention that as a child I hated Animal Farm, and I think now that the reason I hated it was because what it actually showed about what could happen with so-called socialist dictatorship, you know, that they couldn't tell the difference between the pigs and the men.
For me, Orwell always have a great importance for me personally, because it was his writings in The Road to Wigan Pier that convinced me of the case for socialism. And I mean, for me personally, The Road to Wigan Pier lays bare the horrors of capitalism, the idea that in what was at the time one of the most advanced capitalist countries, that people lived such horrendous lives in such poverty and such misery day in, day out. And I mean, there may be a case that things have changed, but truly things have not, comrades. I mean, you look at the homeless camps in America for people who lost their jobs in the 2008 recession, and you think, what the hell's changed? This is an advanced capitalist country, and yet there is still this huge amount of misery, and that for me is the ultimate case for socialism. But all for me, there's an interesting contradiction in that, for me, his works seem to be either a combination or wholly incredibly gloomy and pessimistic, or very optimistic. And if I may, one of my favourite quotes from Orwell, from some thoughts in the Common Toad, which, when I have doubts about socialism, whenever I have doubts, it goes like this anyway. The atom bombs are piling up in the factories, the police are prowling through the cities, the lies are streaming from the loudspeakers, but the earth is still going around the sun, and neither the dictators nor the bureaucrats, deeply as they disapprove of this process, are able to prevent it. And for me that sums up a lot of what Orwell was about, this hope and this inspiration. And whilst a lot of what he did was very dodgy, and he certainly wasn't a Trotskyist in our tradition, for me he'll always remain an inspiration and a hope for the socialist future. Thank you.
Yes, I think that there's a very fine study on George Orwell by a founder of our tradition, Peter Sedgwick, which was in the first series of the International Socialism Journal, which I think is well worth a reprint and a re-examination. But there's the microphone.
We don't have a mic.
There's no microphone. Sorry. Right. Peter Sedgwick wrote a very fine, what was going to be a first stage of a biography on George Orwell in the first series of International Socialism Journal in the late 1960s. I think it's worthy of reprint. But I think what I get from a number of biographies on Orwell, he's very much a prisoner of his own social background. He comes from a middle-ranking bourgeois family. He goes to Eton. He goes into the colonial police service as a junior commander. He does acquire a considerable distaste for British imperialism and its cruelty, and it is a massive transformative event in his life. But I think what what Orwell has is no real understanding of the working class. I think he's termed the proles the proles are the future. The future belongs to the proles. First of all, it's not very Marxist. It's a kind of predictive kind of attitude. It's a fatalistic view that somehow, one way or the other, the working class are bound to somehow get hold of the future direction of history. And I think that attitude is very much seeing the working class as an amorphous mass which lacks any intellectual force. I think it smacks of a degree of condescension. I think I might be reading it wrongly, but certainly Orwell is attacked by the Communist Party from Road to Wigan Pier, where he actually suggests that the poor might actually smell because of the appalling sanitation of the miners in Wigan hovels that is living amongst. And I think Paul Foote also referred to one of Orwell's terrible faults in being too honest, actually being quite blunt without necessary sensitivity to preface his comments. So he's a writer which is quite easy to misinterpret, and maybe I'm making that error myself. But as far as his post-Catalonia period, that's his finest work, I think, on Catalonia, is the period that John refers to as being a problematic one. In the early Cold War, the fear of the Soviet Union, and an anti-Stalinism which pushes him into a very dangerous territory, and what John doesn't refer to. And I don't want to wallow in this because right-wing critics always like to bring him up and save Orwell for their purposes. He refers to this, but the relationship with Victor Gollancz and the Left Book Club, and where Gollancz actually uses 1984 quite cynically, as an anti-communist diatribe, and Orwell's ambivalence over that question is a bit worrying. But also the fact that Orwell does collaborate with the BBC in weeding out people as well, as part, and whether unwittingly or otherwise. Someone who knows the establishment should have known better. So there's a Cold War agenda, and anyone on the left was fair game in that kind of developing situation. But what I would say is that what Orwell does introduce into English literature is a very, very fine, clear and honest, descriptive way of writing. It's incredibly easy, I mean, to read Orwell and get a sense of the time and the events he's describing. And I think it's not just Orwell is. Peter Sedgwick said his subtitle, if I'm right, John, is George Orwell, the first an international socialist. And I think it's in that tradition that unwittingly he finds himself trapped in a number of contradictions on the left. But I think really, deriving from George Orwell, the productive elements of it, is really the essence of international socialism. That's a revolutionary dynamic of a mass movement which will be the instrument, the agency of historical change. I just wish he did have more understanding of the intellectual power that working class could actually represent when the time does come. Thank you.
I was a little bit confused, it's a question really, I was a little bit confused about the idea that Orwell felt that the Labour Party were not really an agent for change. At the time, I think George Lansbury was the leader of the Labour Party. George Lansbury, I don't know if people know anything about him, he'd gone to jail during the First World War because he was a pacifist. After the First World War, he is part of the popular Labour movement. I'm being an apologist for the Labour Party here, not because I am, I'm trying to devil's advocate really. He'd gone to jail because he didn't want to punish the poor as the Labour Party. He'd been quite instrumental in forcing MacDonald out of the Labour Party during this whole idea of working with the Tories, and although he was not a revolutionary, I would argue that he was a socialist. I'd like a little bit more information on that, please.
Well, I thought it was very interesting to hear something about Orwell as a political person as well, even though what you described was actually a person searching for a kind of way to intervene and not really having clear thoughts or methods on that. But I think that his literary works actually led a life of their own in a way, in a sense that's really not that you're really not able to quite pinpoint them as a social intervention, but more as a set of ideas. I remember when I was in school and we got to pick during English literature from two works. One was The One Who Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and the other one was 1984. And I remember a lot of people actually, a lot of my friends, when I joined the sister organization of the SOP, were like, does that mean that you have to live, communism, does that mean that you have to live in the same houses and that you have like total state control? And actually the picture of 1984 and the idea of communism or Stalinism as they thought of it, they described it in this way. So Orwell actually hands out really pretty powerful ideas. On the one hand, what can happen, like sort of dreams or aspirations, what can happen, but also the nightmares, the state control and that kind of thing. So as socialists, these ideas can actually make it really visible for us in a way to illustrate and understand different sentiments among people. Yes.
Okay. Well, first of all, the Sedgwick thing has been reprinted.
Oh.
This is produced by the Revolutionary History people, and they have a stall outside, and they have a big banner, Revolutionary History, and behind it there's a whole number of blokes who almost embody the idea of revolutionary history because they're so old. Ted Crawford, I think, is 78, although he looks younger than me, the bastard. But they've reprinted the Sedgwick article and a number of others. John Molyneux's article on Animal Farm. There's an article by Ian Birchall, Paul O'Flynn. There's some very good stuff in this. When I looked, they had 2 left. But they might have more, but it only costs £6. They might be selling it cheap, so if people go in small numbers, if they want to buy it, if there's a big rush, they'll think, oh, we can charge more. But I think they were trying to get rid of them when I looked. But that has been reprinted. In terms of other things, the International Rescue Committee, it was actually set up during the war, and it was set up by dissident lefties in the United States. Someone who gave it his support was Einstein. Gave it his support, and the idea was it would spring out from occupied Europe or from the Nazi rescue from the Nazis, European non-communist lefties. That was what it was set up to do. But in the course of the war, it does become involved with American intelligence, and after the war, really, it becomes an American intelligence agency, their charitable arm, if you like. And what you get, for example, is that the Bay of Pigs, you know, they set up refugee camps for Cuban refugees, humanitarian activity. The CIA went in and recruited people who later on took part in the Bay of Pigs invasion. You know, this was the way the charity worked. It was a source of intelligence, but also a source of recruits for CIA paramilitary organisations. Played the same role during the Russian occupation of Afghanistan, you know, and this is the organisation that's now headed up by David Miliband. There's a really good book about this called Covert Network. I can't remember the author's name, but it's a very detailed academic study of this organisation, and you can bet your life most, you know, international affairs journalists are familiar with this stuff, but no one mentions this at all. Another thing is I don't accept the idea that Orwell thought the working class smell. What Orwell argued, I would say, what he said is that he was brought up to believe that the working class smelled, and he actually said that this is Harry Pollitt was the first one to lay into him for this. He actually said that if the communists kept repeating this, he'd sue them. He wasn't putting up with this, he'd actually sue them. In terms of the attitude towards the working class, I mean, John Molyneux's article argues this case very well. I don't actually agree with it myself. I think Orwell was grappling with problems, not necessarily in the way that we would grapple with them, but nevertheless there are problems we would recognise. You got Orwell in 1984, for example. Winston Smith argues that the working class will only be free if they can develop a socialist consciousness. But given the way in which their consciousness is dominated by the media and all this sort of thing, the pressures of work, they will only develop a socialist consciousness when they're free. This is the catch-22 situation. You know, how does the working class develop socialist consciousness? Everything is against that development. Huge effort is put in to prevent that development taking place. And Orwell poses this conundrum. He doesn't solve it. He poses it as a conundrum. To be free, the working class have to develop a socialist consciousness, but you know, will they only be able to develop a socialist consciousness once they're free? I would argue that it's struggle. He didn't see the role of class struggle in terms of changing working class consciousness. I think there's only one occasion where Orwell actually writes about a strike. He actually reviews a book about a cook's strike in Britain before the First World War, if my memory serves me right. He's very enthusiastic about it. They all walked out before the main course was served and left them all sitting there waiting. It was a great idea. You see, it comes from having worked in kitchens himself, he can actually identify with it. But it's not something I think he got his head around, the idea of working class struggle as actually changing consciousness. And I think this is where we would disagree with him. I think sometimes he was patronising towards working class people. But you know, there were lots of times he wasn't. He had lots of, I know it sounds trite, he had lots of working class friends. He was someone who came from a particular background, but nevertheless argued for a society where people with his background would be indistinguishable from everyone else. One reason he liked Spain was that in Spain, people didn't recognise him as having a posh accent. You know, that even communists would call him sir once they heard him speak. You know, working class communists would call him sir when he was chatting to them, and this was something that, as far as he was concerned, this was what you wanted to get rid of. So there are all sorts of problems. But one point worth making is when you look at the history of the Trotskyist movement in this time, the Trotskyist movement confronts these same problems and makes all sorts of mistakes as well. You know, at least Orwell didn't convince himself that Russia was a degenerate workers' state. You know. At least Orwell avoided the idea that, you know, Orwell would not have apologised for Pol Pot. You know, this is, to some extent, when Orwell's books in the Cold War period were confiscated by the right, Animal Farm was taught as an anti-revolutionary book at that time. 1984 was used as propaganda. You know, both the Americans paid for a book, the CIA paid for a film of Animal Farm, the cartoon film, was paid for by the CIA. They insisted on changes. You know, not all farmers had to be shown as bad, some had to be shown as good to their animals. Snowball had to be shown as bad as Napoleon. You know, they insisted on certain changes, which I think is quite significant. But they were confiscated by the right. But what I would argue is what made that confiscation possible was the fact that at that time the bulk of the left still thought that Russia was a workers' state, was socialist, was somehow progressive. It's the left that handed these books over. Orwell saw them as attacking Stalinism from a left-wing position, but it's the left that remained for so long still arguing that there was something progressive about Stalinism. This was what allowed those books to be confiscated, and of course there was nothing he could do about it because he was dead. You know, and I think there is evidence, as I'm sure people know, where he's already worried about this. You know, he wrote to an American, a Lovestonite. I don't know if people are familiar with the Lovestonites, the right opposition in the United States, the Bukharinists. These do all become involved with the CIA. Jay Lovestone, ends up working for the CIA. The former leader of the American Communist Party was expelled for being a Bukharinist. Orwell writes to this bloke and says, these are not anti-socialist works. These are not anti-socialist, but they're confiscated. And I think that we begin to get them back in the 60s. As a student, I found Orwell absolutely inspiring. And I think this begins to change in the 60s. He's still someone that people consider worth fighting over. Although the fact is, we don't know where he'd stand today, except that he'd be about 110. But that there is a lot of inspiring stuff in Orwell, and I would argue right up until his death, he's trying to negotiate difficult times that were causing problems for everyone on the left. But at the time, he's one of those people on the left who had a commitment to socialism as a classless global society. He still had that there, and he still said that's the only thing really worth fighting for.
And I'm glad you mentioned the Paula Flynn essay on him, because it was in a book I think called Them and Us in Literature, which the International Socialists did, and I think it was about 1975-76, around about then, and there was a lot of good articles in that. Yeah. And I really liked the one in Orwell, because in the early 70s I was like a young union rep, and I worked with people who were in the Communist Party, and it was in Glasgow, and the Communist Party were very big in Glasgow, a huge pool of people. And I think one of the reasons, there's a whole number of reasons, one of the reasons I didn't join the Communist Party is because I'd read Orwell when I was a kid, and I was quite ambivalent about it. But I always hated people that said things like go back to Russia, and my dad hated, my dad wasn't a communist, but he hated McCarthyism, and I grew up as a kid in that. And always, when people said go back to Russia, I always felt I would want to defend the fact that they'd had a revolution without really understanding. And I think the thing about Orwell that was important for people of my generation was he posed that question about what the weaknesses in Stalin, what we see as Stalinism. And it was only when I joined the IS and read an article in the Centre Spread Out State Capitalism that I realised Orwell had been quite important. He was never around an organisation that could be able to explain that to him. But I think he put enough seeds in the mind of people like me to question what was an offer from Stalinism. And I think that's quite important. And the problem at school, I remember we had one English teacher who tried to teach it as a right-wing text, and another guy, it turned out later it was a guy who gave us novels like Catch-22 and stuff like that, who was a communist. We didn't know it at the time. He was a brilliant English teacher. And I remember him arguing that, no, George Orwell was a socialist, which kind of threw that open. So I think he's there to be contested over, and it's good you've done a book in it, I think, as well.
Well, I must congratulate the speaker on a very fine address that he's given us, very informative, I think. I first read Homage to Catalonia in about 1959, when I was something like 16, and it had a profound effect upon me. I also would like to record that Orwell encountered quite a few problems and difficulties in getting Animal Farm published. The Stalinists were onto this, and they put blocks and obstacles in his path in trying to get it published. I think also Orwell may have been the first, or was one of the first, to employ the term state capitalism, if I remember. And when you think about 1984, where you get these three power blocks fighting each other, not always in the same combination of power blocks, one thinks perhaps today of Iran, the USA and Syria fighting ISIS or ganging up against ISIS, and it may be a rough parallel. And just two final thoughts. I think in 1947, if I remember correctly, Orwell already warned the Americans that this is just before McCarthyism, or just about the time that McCarthy was getting into the saddle. He was saying something like, if you employ the tactics of Stalinism to combat communism, you know, there's a big problem there. And the final thing I'd like to say is that I'm somewhat disappointed that Orwell perhaps didn't focus a bit more on the evils of Nazism, with the discovery of the death camps towards the end of the war and so on. That seems to be something that's slightly missing, if you like, from his writing. But I think finally Orwell is a figure of great intellectual integrity, of great clarity of thought, and writes English beautifully with great simplicity, but without being simplistic.
I've always been particularly interested in the ideas in Orwell's writing. An affinity has often been drawn between the ideas in 1984 with a sort of Hegelian Marxian thinking of the Frankfurt School. For instance, Orwell, I know, was very scathing about Enlightenment, empiricism and Cartesian rationalism. Their division of reason and the senses, of subject and object, of fact and values, and those sorts of things, which of course Hegel and Marx also are involved in a big critique of. And I was wondering, John, if you might have something more to say about this. There are a whole series of, you know, we almost get a sort of dialectic where he comes up with the sort of oxymorons like war is peace, freedom is slavery, and ignorance is strength. These sorts of binary oppositions, and also the way he thinks about history. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. And I sort of think again about Croce's famous remark that all philosophy, all history is contemporary history. That we always see the past through the prism of the present. But this, of course, presents big problems, because it could make historical understanding impossible if each era reads its own mind into history, and then that's followed by another era reading its own mind, and so we get a whole series of disjointed histories without any sort of logos connecting them. I was wondering what your thoughts are then on these intellectual ideas that particularly we get from 1984. I'm thinking, you know, of epistemology, which really is about how we verify and justify our ideas. There's this lovely thing, I think he says, if I just quickly, in 1984, I tell you, Winston, the reality is not external. Reality exists in the human mind and nowhere else. Not in the individual mind, which can make mistakes, and in any case soon perishes, only in the mind of the party, which is collective and immortal. Whatever the party holds to be truth, is truth. It is impossible to see really except by looking through the eyes of the party. Wow, what a sort of chilling indictment of a sort of fossilizing idealism or holism, you know, and obviously, you know, the dynamic dialectic that we get from Hegel and Marx stands in stark opposition to that sort of chilling holism, you know, the totalitarian state.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out
Speak up.
in the line in the Unicorn, he mentions particularly, he talks about the English working class, and he mentions that the character of the English is not agreeable as such. He seems to be very, very critical of the English working class in particular, and doesn't see them as having very clear socialist ideas, and sees them as being easily won over to the ruling class idea. That sort of prediction of, I think, what's coming true now with the rise of UKIP and that type of thing. So he sees that perhaps the English working class are not really easily conscious of their fellows, their sort of fellow people in suffering. They're sort of quite selfish inherently, and he sees that they can be quite easily won over by the ideas of the far right, and he's quite negative into sort of the future of socialism, and particularly in Britain.
I taught George Orwell, Animal Farm in 1984 as an English teacher in Edinburgh quite a few years ago. One thing that's not been mentioned, I think, one thing that's not been mentioned about George Orwell that resonates with some of the sensibilities that's come across, however, in a couple of points, is that I think George Orwell was lost in his class situation. And I think that comes up in Shakespeare's Prince Hal. And in fact, a friend of mine who went to a top public school, which I didn't, is that particularly down and out in London and Paris, and I think this comes up with the fact that he's got a novel of ideas and it's not full of human empathy, is that he was lost in his class position and he was trying to find his identity by joining the working classes and washing dishes up and so on, to see if he could find more meaning in life from the life that he had, the life that he had inherited, which he didn't find that meaningful. And so his engagement with different social worlds was also at the same time representing psychological problems he had, and he did have them because he went away to some Scottish islands to be on his own for quite considerable periods of time. And I think that's a significant part of his biography. So I think he had identity problems that was probably coming from the fact of his class position, and yet he couldn't move into another class position because that's just difficult to achieve. So I think, you know, he was caught in different life worlds, but he didn't feel he belonged to any of them.
Two things. One, a defence of Orwell's anti-Stalinism. Firstly, we should differentiate between Orwell the man and Orwell the writer. Orwell the man made all sorts of bad decisions, didn't have much open to him, but alliances were... I must say, when you talk about international rescue, I can't stop thinking about Thunderbirds, but... but that
David Miliband.
But that he allied himself with people, with groups where certainly we know better, and probably he should have known better. But I think, particularly in Homage Catalonia and then Animal Farm in 1984, he is intervening in an important discussion on the British and on the European left, and he's basically on the right side. He goes into Spain wanting to fight fascism, with sympathies towards the Stalinists, towards the Communist Party. Through his experience from the role of the Communist Party in Spain, he develops a very, very, very good critique of the myth and the reality of what Stalin's foreign policy means for, among other things, that led to the defeat of the Spanish Revolution. It's a very, very clear discussion with other socialists with severe implications. With Animal Farm in 1984, we have again in the time after the Hitler-Stalin Pact, where even the best of the left, as I say, the Trotskyists, the best of the left, are somehow seeing that the Soviet Union has something in it that was something, the remnants of the worker state here. Here, Orwell is making a very sharp criticism, say, I am for socialism, I am for equality, and I see none of this in the Soviet Union. And I think the ideas which he's putting forward in these books is something that, for the fledgling sort of socialist review group and the people who are pushing in the direction that there's got to be an alternative to capitalism and to Stalinism, that Orwell the writer was very much on the right side, and that's something to defend. Going about sorry, I'm not a psychologist, but I think the development of Orwell politically, the Down Out in Paris and London, is more him going as an individual, trying to see how it is, and wrote to Wigan Pier a bit as well, how it is the working class experience thing. With Homage to Catalonia, we see him actually engaging in collective struggle with other things, and the political thing, I think, come over. It's a lot less observatory of what happens to the working class and more to what happens in people in struggle and things become. We find that after the defeat of the Spanish Civil War, with the growth of Stalin, with the isolation of the left, we come back in the later novels again to a more isolated Orwell, who is more commenting on the world and being part of the world. And I think the psychology of Orwell in what he's doing changes and reaches high points in Homage to Catalonia, when he's definitely involved in the collective struggle and not observing on the struggles or the life of other people.
I mean, I can't remember who said about Orwell and the Holocaust. I mean, I think that's a very valid point. When you've got to put it into context, though, because Orwell was not alone in misunderstanding the enormity of the Holocaust at this time. He was certainly not alone in it. What I think doesn't let him off the hook, though, is some of the people he was closely associated with, like Dwight MacDonald. And he wrote Hannah Arendt had an article at that time arguing for the enormity of the Holocaust, and Orwell, we know, wrote for this same magazine, and I suspect must have read her article. So he did have people who he was familiar with their work who were arguing that this was something extraordinary. This was not just another pogrom, this was something extraordinary. And I don't think Orwell got his head around that at all. I think that's a very valid criticism. When you look at his early life, he certainly flirted with a sort of low-level, upper-class anti-Semitism. I think there is an element of anti-Semitism in Down and Out in Paris and London, for example. But the experience of fascism makes him an anti-Semite. And this is part of his development. I mean, all our lives are unfinished stories, if you like, that we are learning and changing all the time, all of us. And this is true of Orwell as well, that he develops up until he dies. But I think it is something that is of interest, that he doesn't get his head around the Holocaust. But only a minority of people who thought about these things did at the time, it's fair to say, and that includes Jewish people. They hadn't got their heads around it. It's really only in the 60s, I think, that the Holocaust is recognised as, my God, this is something absolutely extraordinary, rather than just another sort of massacre sort of thing. But it is an interesting point. In terms of, there is a joke, I don't know how good it is, but one thing you've got to recognise with Orwell is that he had a sort of prescience where he saw that the name Blair would become cursed through the ages, and he decided to change his name to Orwell. This astonishing prescience. I mean, in terms of war is peace, you can't go think better than the peace envoy in the Middle East, can you? Who, for some reason, continually calls for war. This is obviously took Orwell very much on board. I'm not sure where Orwell stood in terms of... I think Orwell thought that there was a truth that could be established once. I'm not sure what he thought the circumstances of this were, but he doubted whether those sort of conditions would ever obtain again, because truth was... He'd seen battles invented in Spain, the Daily Worker had made up whole battles which were then reported by other papers. He'd seen so many lies told about not just small events, like, I don't know, a small thing like Butler Schloss being unbiased, it's only a small lie. He'd seen enormous lies about the nature of whole societies. I'm not sure really how his thinking was developing along that road. He did encounter Jean-Paul Sartre, for example, who he didn't like at all, which doesn't come as a surprise. Quite unfair, I think, towards Sartre. I think that you can find in his works a sort of critique of aspects of postmodernism, where he goes on about some systems of thinking don't help understand anything except odd puddles of knowledge. And I've always felt that about postmodernism. These are clever people. They're bound to come up with some stuff that's right, but generally speaking, the mass of the argument is not very useful, but there still is the odd insight. I think he still thought that the truth was out there, if you like, in a quite an old-fashioned way. In terms of the working class, well, no, two things. I'll name these two things. First of all, I'm not convinced by the idea that he had an identity crisis of any kind myself. To some extent, I think this identity phenomenon has been used by some students of Orwell to avoid actually engaging with his politics seriously. If you can put it down to some sort of psychological thing, you don't actually have to engage with his socialist ideas. And I think this is not a new phenomenon. In the Rob Coles book that I've reviewed, Coles argues this on a number of occasions. Orwell never really left Eton. Yes, he did. There were two men, Orwell and Blair. No, there wasn't. One was calling himself by the other name. This is a way of avoiding grappling with the seriousness of Orwell's politics. And Orwell was very, very serious about politics. When he went to Wigan Pier, he went there to write a book that would tell people in the South how bad things were in the North, and he assumed that primarily it would be read by middle-class people. And it's written by a middle-class socialist for a middle-class audience. He's not a revolutionary socialist yet, but he writes it for a middle-class audience. It's a very deliberate work of political propaganda. I don't think it shows any evidence of an identity crisis myself. I'm sure he had all the sort of problems that we all have, but I'm not convinced by that. I think it's a way of avoiding actually dealing with his politics in a serious way. The other thing, in terms of the working class, I can understand where he's coming from. When you look at the Great Depression, in the 1930s in Britain, you get Spain, for example. Orwell thought Spain is a decisive struggle, and yet, as far as he was concerned, most working class people in Britain couldn't give a monkeys about it. And there's a lot of evidence to support that. There was a small number of working class people on the left who cared about Spain, but most working class people weren't bothered about Spain. It didn't impinge upon their lives at all. And I think Orwell, the conclusions he draws from this, I would say, are wrong. And part of the reason for this is that he does seem to miss, and this is a criticism of it, he does seem to miss some mass movements. In 1935, for example, there's a massive campaign against changes to benefits in Britain, involving hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets. Hundreds of thousands. It's hard to believe Orwell didn't join in these demonstrations. You had large numbers of middle class people taking to the streets on these demonstrations as well, not just working class people. They actually forced the government to suspend the changes to the benefit system. A tremendous victory in a time of defeat. There's no mention of this in Orwell at all, and I can't help feeling myself that one of the weaknesses is that, as I said already, he doesn't engage with the working class in struggle really outside of Spain. He doesn't engage with strikes, he doesn't engage with protests in Britain in the way that I think would have led to him understanding the way that consciousness could change. But at the rock bottom, what Orwell was committed to, I would argue, is a classless society in which the ruling class no longer existed, in which dramatic fundamental social change had taken place, and the inevitable ruling class resistance to this had been put down by force. And from that point of view, I think Orwell raises a question there that today's reformists, the left reformists of today, we have to ask them, if your programme was adopted by a mass movement, how would the ruling class respond? Would they just say, all right, have all my money, you know, I don't care, have it all? Or would we actually be in the position that, you know, that our tradition says they will resist by force? That's what they've always done, and I think that's what they will always do. And Orwell recognised this, and this is, you know, this is at least one of the lessons we can draw from Orwell's politics. Yeah.